He contextualizes the changing built environment, the urban environment, with nature, using the tools of geography and archaeology. And I would call Steve, in the purest sense, an interdisciplinary artist, and that is why he's here for our class, so that you can experience firsthand what an interdisciplinary artist does and how that happens. Steve is actually originally from Houston. He now teaches at the University of Minnesota. And so please help me welcome Steve Rowell.
Thank you. Great, thanks so much for having me. And thanks to all of you for showing up to class today. As a professor myself, it can be challenging during times of COVID. I thought I would explain, I guess, a bit about how I work as an interdisciplinarian artist, but I also wanted to go into some detail and explain or describe a current work that I'm doing. So I'll talk about that later using this kind of typical PowerPoint presentation. I'll delve into my website a little bit. I understand that you all took a look at my site or will for an assignment. And I'll also explain, I guess, how I use things like collaborative maps in my work. And a few other applications, or I should say online resources that are really handy but also really useful. And at the very end, I'll sort of touch on why I'm here, or why I was invited, which is basically to initiate a project. And that's going to be a year-long project starting now, and will continue until next semester, or sorry, the fall of 2022, in which I'll teach a master class. And that's still being sorted out, but I think I have an idea as to how it's going to work. So it involves investigating some topics and getting students involved, members of the public, and producing something, I hope, pretty wonderful. So let's dive right in. Let me start up with my website. Let me bring over browser, sorry. I've been working for about 20 years in various capacities, I suppose. So the last 10 years or so, I've dived mostly into my own solo work. My website lists, many projects I've done over the years, different issues, different topics, different themes, ways of approaching the landscape, which is what I do. I work on the landscape. My work's about the landscape. It's considered a critical landscape practice. As an artist and experimental geographer, as a term that was thrown around for a while about 15 years ago by artists of my ilk. But before I really spun off doing my solo work, I worked with a group called the Center for Land Use Interpretation. That is a fairly well-known organization in the sort of canon of contemporary interdisciplinary artists. It's an LA-based organization, and there's quite a bit about it online from various resources. Different people have written about the center for quite some time. It's also known as CLUI, or C-L-U-I. These projects are all examples of work I did with them. They range in topics, things as banal as parking spaces. This one's called Pavement Paradise, American Parking Space. It's focused primarily on the Los Angeles region because that's where the center's headquartered. And I guess it goes out into far-flung areas like Wendover, which is a place on the Salt Flats of Utah, close to the state line of Nevada and Utah. It's where the center has an artist residency program, and has since, I think, 1998, so quite some time ago. I got involved with the center in 2000 and 2001 primarily, so it was after this major shift in American politics and the American culture as we know it, with 9/11, of course, occurring in late September 2001. And that affected things considerably on many levels, but also in the way artists worked on the landscape. This is a post-military landscape. It was the place where the Enola Gay plane was trained to drop the bomb on Japan in World War II. So one of these buildings were all military, all U.S. Army base buildings, and there was a large hangar, it's still there actually, with the words Enola Gay that have been since sort of eroded through time, or as entropy has sort of kicked in. But the center does a variety of activities out there, and there's tons of information on their website about that. But we did a project kind of like overlooking the history of Wendover. And the list kind of goes on, the types of things that we looked at. But I wanted to move more in the present. I should mention one thing. You might have heard of this thing called the Whitney Biennial. It's an artist biennial every 2 years. It occurs in New York City at the Whitney Museum. And in 2006, we were invited to participate in that and had a small touchscreen as like a visitor center explaining what the center does as the art object. And it was kind of controversial in certain art circles because it's so didactic and informational, but that's kind of the aesthetic of the center, right? It's just about explaining things in a way that appears to be objective, completely unbiased, but actually has some winks and some nudges kind of integrated in the politics of what we do. But that is, it's a well-known biennial that occurs, again, like I said, in New York City. So when we did this show, it kind of put us firmly in the art world box, as it were. And sort of from that point forward, so now 15 years ago, the center's been closely associated with the art world in a more sort of conventional sense. I mean, not conventional, but in the most, I guess, understandable way, you know, that I, as an artist, am now considered, you know, by the art world as a recognized artist because of these inclusions in things like biennials. But that did allow me to then meet a lot of people and sort of branch into my own practice. And that's one of the things that students ask a lot. It's like, how did you get to become an artist after you studied art, right? And there's a lot of ways to do that. A lot of front doors through galleries and stuff like that. And there are a lot of side doors, and so that's, I guess, considered one of the side doors. So if any of you are interested in going into the arts and don't want to do a traditional sort of gallery approach, which can be quite challenging because the percentage of student artists or recent graduates who can actually get shown in galleries is actually quite small. Because there's so much competition out there. So there are a lot of ways in which you can sort of get around that lump. But I wanted to dive into a recent project that I did that was shown during the pandemic, which was challenging. It was called Uncanny Sensing Remote Valleys. It was funded by a Creative Capital grant. Creative Capital is a fantastic organization, also New York based, that once you turn 25, you can apply to. You have to be a graduate. You can't be a student anymore. But people can apply to that, and you get a large sum of money to basically commit years worth of your time to a project. So I would highly recommend looking into that after you graduate and you start a practice as an artist. It's called Creative Capital. So this project, I'm not going to go into too much detail because it's quite complex. It involves remote sensing and remote sensing technologies. I understand there are probably some engineering students in the audience. That's why I wanted to mention this project. It showed most recently at a place in the University of Oregon in Eugene, again during the lockdown, so it was only approached through an online virtual exhibition. It never actually opened to the public in terms of physical presence, but it has this pretty amazing interactive exhibit that they created for me using multiple cameras in the space. So I encourage you to take a look at that. You can listen to audio, you can look at some of the video samples and read the captions for the videos. I won't go into that because if I tried navigating that screen from this angle, it would probably make me, you know, seasick. But I do want to point out, you know, I did a version of this exhibition here in Houston. This is why I'm talking about it, in 2014. So I started this project in 2013 and did a prototype in Wisconsin in this kind of it was kind of focused on the northern forest as a sort of like primeval place of experimentation with the technologies I was using. But I wanted to do the opposite of that. I wanted to work in a very technological environment. So I was invited to attend a festival that occurred here in Houston called Countercurrent that the Mitchell Center also was in charge of and organized. So they commissioned like a prototype which was focused on the Houston region. And what is key here is that the work involves using technologies like trail cameras to detect wolves, like that first photograph. Or in the case of Houston, I contacted and worked with the City of Houston environmental air monitoring program. So it's like a division of the city government that actually uses the largest network of air monitoring stations around in the whole world, actually, but it's the largest in the world. But it's a very complex system that they have stations set up around the city, and they have mobile stations they can deploy to places. And what it does, the picture on the right is an example of that. There are these installations that will actually inhale the chemicals in the atmosphere and break down and detect each individual discrete chemical that's being emitted from things like that, which is a oil refinery, which there are a lot of course, down the ship channel. So I took that data and I sonified it. So I made this sort of soundtrack that I then cut a video to, or actually 3 videos to, and had that be the primary component of this exhibition that I did here. And I can play a quick sample of that. This video here is extracts of 5 different videos in the exhibition. So you're going to see the first minute and a half. It features, the beginning is a different rendering a different video that I use, but the audio that you're hearing after that first part, in fact, maybe I'll just fast forward to it, is the audio I'm talking about. It's tonal, and it's based on, you might know of this instrument called a harmonium. It's used in classical Indian music to kind of establish drone tones. Usually it's done with kind of like an acoustic device that has bellows, like a bagpipe sort of, or like a harpsichord. I'm sorry, not harpsichord, but a accordion. But it actually produces these drone tones that then other musicians play with. So I took an electronic version of that and then created these different tones using the molecular number of each chemical that was detected in the atmosphere at that time from these sensors. So the toxins that are basically around us all the time that we're breathing, you're actually hearing like a sonified version of that data. So that's what we're going to be listening to really quickly, and I'm hoping the sound actually works. We'll see if that's the case. If it streams properly. That's always a fun thing to look at, isn't it? The old buffering circle. Let's exit out, see if it'll work this way. I realize that I might not be connected to the internet on my laptop, so I'm sure I'm not actually. EduRoam would work normally, but I'm not sure if I'm able to connect to that. There we go. So that is, should I try guest probably instead? Guest. Let's see if that works. Okay. Apologies for this. Let's refresh the page really quickly. Okay, so that's working. Right. So there should be sound here on my laptop, but you all can't hear that. Let me see if I can pull this up. I mean, it's on my laptop, but it's not coming off of. You all can't hear it through the speakers, can you? Yeah? Okay. That's coming off my laptop, I think.
Oh, really?
Yeah. There we go. So it is working over here. So that tone is an example, basically. If you can barely hear it where you're sitting, it's supposed to be much louder than that, but that's the sound. And it's really unfortunate because you really can't hear this. So let me try something really quickly. I know, I need to change the audio to HDMI. There we go. So I'll go back. There we go. This is a way of stacking the video for this particular installation. When it was shown in Houston, these were actually three large screens filling an entire space, and the audio was played through 500-watt speakers, so it was actually quite loud and kind of overwhelming, but that was the intent. So that is an example of the way that I'm sort of sonifying data. There's, of course, if you were to go on my website, there's other examples of that that you can listen to later, so I'll leave it at that. But I do want to come back to my website here on the home page and maybe delve into a current project that I'm working on now with my partner Priyanka Basu. And this is about fertilizer, which sounds boring, but more than that, it's about dead zones, plural. You may have heard of the dead zone, which is this thing that occurs off the Gulf of Mexico. It's about the size of the state of Massachusetts, they say. Every summer it appears between basically the Mississippi River in Louisiana all the way to Lake Charles, or a bit further west, depending on how large it is. So it's about 100 and, I don't know, what is that, 200 miles roughly? It's quite large, and it's a large algal plume, and what that does is it decreases the amount of light and oxygen in the water so that things die beneath it, essentially. So fish and shellfish cannot survive beneath the dead zone. And it's algae that exists because of overflow of fertilizer down the river, all the way down the Mississippi, from places like where I live in Minnesota. And why is there so much fertilizer in the river? It's because it's being over-applied to places like cornfields and soybean fields in Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois, Nebraska. The list goes on, all the way down. Also people's lawns, actually. There's a lot of problems with fertilizer overflow from people's lawns. So I've got a quick presentation that kind of explains a bit more about the dead zone. I'll go and start that up here. Let's see if my notes show. There we go. As with most of my projects, they begin organically, and by that I mean I have ideas about sites, about landscapes that I want to visit, that I want to actually work in. And back in 2016, I was invited to the University of Florida, which is in Gainesville, like the main campus at the U of H, or U of F, excuse me, to do a 2-week project, like a critical landscape project with some of the students, undergrad and graduate. And that involved 2 tours, one at the southern part of the state and one at the northern part of the state. And I decided to focus on extraction, which is a big topic in the art world right now. You know, things that we take out of the ground or pull from the air, pull out of the water. And one of the things they extract in Florida are the raw materials for the production of fertilizer. And this happens to be one of the most kind of interesting discoveries. When I was at the University of Florida, I realized that they have this thing called the Henry T. Odom Center for the Wetlands. Why is that exciting? It's because Odom is credited as one of the founders of modern ecology studies. If you're an environmental studies major, you might know that. You may have heard of his name. But Odom attempted to equate the intricacies and chaos of the natural world with the ordered and predictable world of computer systems and engineering, and they didn't quite work. They actually tried to force the data into what the computer could understand, and generated false results from that. So their attempt to basically squeeze nature into a computer did not quite work as planned. And there's entire books written on that failure. But Odom, back to the point, Odom was critical of the disruptions of American agriculture and how it was affecting the natural ecosystems, but he did not foresee the scale of the impact on endangered species around the world, and this thing called a runaway feedback loop of destruction that might come as a result of that. So this is like a little mosaic that was at the center that I thought was really a great way to start this project, to think about it. As I mentioned, agriculture is a big issue, of course, in the Midwest. Big ag, I'm highly critical of big ag in the kind of like monoculture sense because of what it does. This is basically a prairie landscape, or was a prairie landscape in Minnesota, of which is most of it is basically obliterated. It's been removed, scraped away, displacing indigenous peoples, right? And their food sources, their culture has been largely decimated as a result of that. So this is a project which is not just about interrogating an industrial sort of story in the landscape, but it's about interrogating the sort of colonial settler story, right? I mean, I'm a white person, but I'm coming at it from a critical lens. I'm considered a colonial settler in that sense, right? As an American. And I'm realizing, of course, it's a huge part of the story in Minnesota is the displacement of indigenous peoples. But key to this project is the displacement of their prairie, right? The things that they basically lived on. It's been basically leveled, scraped away, irrigated, and turned into this. And this is inverted and grayscaled for stylistic reasons. I wanted to sort of stress the sort of artificiality of these places, right? This is very, very far from what it was before we came through and decided to convert the land as we did. But where does fertilizer come from? It comes from things like this, believe it or not: shark's teeth, shark cartilage, whale bones, other invertebrate bones from millions and millions of years ago. So all that material over the course of millions of years ago, when Florida was basically a shallow sea, compacted on the seafloor and turned into stuff like potash, which is this grainy white mineral that they dig up from the ground. One of the largest fertilizer producers is in a place called Bone Valley in southern Florida. This plant, the Mosaic New Wales plant, produces 3 million tons of processed phosphates and 1.4 millions of phosphoric acid per year. Nutrient-limited White Springs complex, White Springs, Florida. This is up north. This is the sort of northern part of the tour I did with the students. This is a massive earthwork, but it's not an artwork in the typical sense of an earthwork. It's a giant waste pile of potash, sort of tailings basically. So when they dig up the dirt with these things, the drag lines, they basically produce a huge amount of waste, and that's what it looks like when it just sits there. This is actually low-level radioactive waste too, believe it or not. And after all the digging, the ground kind of looks like this. So this was a woodland. Now it's basically kind of a Venusian landscape or a lunar landscape, right? But what happens to this material? What do they do with it, right? Well, they make it into things like potassium fertilizer, but there's also other places like this. This is a nitrogen complex on the Missouri River, actually near Sioux City, Iowa, where they produce nitrogen fertilizer into a gas, basically. And it's using an advanced version of this weird thing called the Haber process, which is, you should look into this. There's a great podcast about the Haber process because basically it changed the way that we produce food, and it allowed us to basically feed 7 billion people on the planet. But Fritz Haber was, ironically, the father of chemical warfare. He was working for the German military after World War I to develop chemical weapons, essentially, that they used in World War II. But a byproduct of that chemistry happened to be the process to produce fertilizer, ironically, that fed all these people and still feeds us today through the production of corn and soybean, essentially, and other crops, of course. I'm also looking at things like this. This is Cargill. This is one of the biggest agribusiness companies in America. They're headquartered in Minneapolis, about 5 miles from my house. So I flew a drone over it one day and got a nice aerial. Did the same thing by inverting the image and grayscaling it to kind of accentuate the synthetic quality of this particular location. There's companies like this, Big Gain. They basically produce feed for animals, and they use genetically modified corn and soy crop solids to produce that feed, which then of course makes things like cows and pigs bigger yields, bigger animals, bigger profits is kind of the point. Of course, algal blooms are natural occurring. This is Lake Itasca, which is the headwaters of the Mississippi River in northern Minnesota. So it's a beautiful place. It has a native wild rice crop that grows on it that's actually farmed using non-destructive means by Native Americans who live in that part of Minnesota. But there are algal blooms that do occur in the summer, but it doesn't actually occur, right? So not all algae is bad. It just happens to be when there's too much of it. This is a shot of the infant Mississippi River as it's winding its way across Minnesota. That thing's about 3 feet wide at that point, so it's very fragile. And I mention that because it's flowing across a pipeline. So that diagonal line that's sort of plowed through, that's a pipeline owned by the Koch brothers, KOCH, if you're interested in the politics of fossil fuel. Just Google Koch brothers fossil fuel and you'll get a million results, people that are sort of focusing on them as particular players in the corporate world that are very much sort of maligned by activists, oil activists. Let's see, water filtration sites like this. This is along the Mississippi in northern Minneapolis. The problem with trying to clean the water like this is an urban water filtration system, is that it oftentimes introduces detergents into the river that then flows all the way down the down the country into the Gulf of Mexico. That actually contributes to the production of the dead zone as well. Industrial sites, of course, like this too, are part of the problem. This is a large, I think it's like a quartz mine off the Mississippi River, kind of south of St. Paul, again, Minnesota, so we're still way up north. Once navigable, Mississippi River is, of course, dammed and channelized like crazy up there. It's no longer its normal, natural, self in a lot of ways. From this point, lock number one, dam number one, forward or down, it's quite a bit altered, as it were. I'll skip through some of these for time. Right, this is a curious thing. This is a pyramid in Memphis, Tennessee, adjacent to the river. It's probably the most bizarre Bass Pro Shop I've ever seen in my life. There's a lot of them that are kind of funky and weird and theme parkish, but this one actually kind of like, that hit a new chord. It was designed to be a different sort of theme park at one point that was abandoned and then later bought by Bass Pro. But I mention that because it just kind of goes to show you how artificial, in a way, our idea of what outdoors recreation has become. If you go into this place, you'll realize it's like everything's, of course, artificial wood and, fabricated to look like a natural setting with fake trees. But they do have real fish and birds in this kind of zoo kind of quadrant of the shop, but they're funny. But just a few hundred feet from that is this amazing scale model in the Mississippi River, scaled down into like concrete channels. This is a close-up of what it looks like. That's a scale model of Memphis. You can't see the pyramid because it's too small here, but that's like a detail showing the contours of the river itself. So incredibly accurate scale model. This is the delta, so that's Louisiana on the left. It's turned sideways, basically, south is to the right. The delta, also known as the bird foot, extends out in the Gulf of Mexico, and you can actually walk around on this and explore it. Pretty amazing. I look at sites like this because scale models are important to think about when you're looking at things like hydrology and engineering of riverways and how that is part of the landscape story. This is an abandoned Mississippi River model in Jackson, or near Jackson, Mississippi. It was actually the largest, or is the largest of its kind ever made in the world. It's a cast concrete model of an entire river system. So the entire Mississippi, basically, from the headwaters down to the Gulf. And now it's kind of laying there, just eroding, by the elements over time. All those little metal things that you see scattered, those were to represent things like trees, because they would actually flow water to see how water, moved across the land if it were to flood out of the channels of the river. This was built back in the 1950s and operated until, I think, the mid-60s. And then it's basically just been lying there slowly, just kind of falling apart. But an amazing place. This is an example of how artificial the water looks. This is near the Mississippi River in Louisiana. That is a very large potash, that's an ammonia plant. This is St. James Parish in Louisiana. And some of their tailings go into these ponds just to let them evaporate into the air. But you see kind of, again, how the algae loves the waste material and just blooms and blooms in this water. So it turns that incredible prismatic green. This is a different plant in a place called Donaldsville, Louisiana. They produce nitrogen products. Again, it turns into fertilizer that then gets shipped up to places like the upper Midwest. And of course, the waste products, flow down months or years later and emptying out through the bird foot or the delta. That's an aerial shot of the delta right there as it kind of empties out into the Gulf of Mexico. So this project is being published actually next week, weirdly enough, in Germany in a book. So that'll be coming out first. It's like a photo essay and an essay that's about this sort of the story of fertilizer and the land using some of these photographs. But I'll leave it at that. It's going to be a film. It's going to be a multi-screen video too that I'm working on this winter. I'm actually going to be editing it this winter during a residency in New Hampshire. But I wanted to now turn to a project that I'm thinking about doing here. How are we doing for time? 6:12. Okay, cool. When I was invited to come here, Melissa and I talked about doing something that involves, my interest in environmental justice in this part of the world. Being from here, I'm very much attached to or I'm very much invested in, I should say, the sort of the health of the people, the health of the land. You know, I had relatives who 1 degree separation worked for the oil industry, not as executive types, just as like grunts. You know, my dad was basically like was a roughneck when he was 15 years old, working on oil rigs for, you know, pennies a day, I'm sure. So there's that funny connection, but, you know, I had been fairly knowledgeable of things, I guess, around the oil industry for quite some time. And I'm going to bounce back over to this browser. Sorry, let me just see if I can find my cursor here. Well, there it is. So back in 2006 or 7, I should say, the Mitchell Center invited Cluey, who I mentioned at the beginning of this, to do a project, a large-scale project in Houston. And we decided, what can we do? You know, let's look at oil. So we did a project called Texas Oil. This is a map that we put together using a Google, collaborative Google My Map. This is, you know, one of the things I want to show you all, that if you don't know about My Maps, it's not quite the same as using maps on your phone. It's a more sort of interactive tool that you can collaborate with others by inviting them, like you would with like a Google Share Drive or something. So again, this is like a 14-year-old map at this point, but it still lives online. So you can see the scale. You know, we shot aerial photographs and video of the West Texas oil fields way out there. Corporate headquarters in Dallas, all over downtown Houston. But we also filmed some of the refineries as far down as Corpus Christi and as far east over as Baton Rouge, mostly in Texas, but we did cover a few spots in Louisiana. But I want to zoom in on the ship channel, which is over here. You can see just how many locations we looked at here. Each red dot represents a site of interest that we either photographed or photographed nearby. And let's see if I can do this. Here we go, this is a lot better, that's smarter. What I am thinking about for this project is sort of extracting from some of that research to produce a field guide to environmental racism, which is a term that some of you are familiar with, right? How corporations basically deploy racism as kind of a weapon against certain types of people, depending on where they live. And that usually occurs in places where a person, say, a family, say, cannot afford to move from. So it happens here in Houston where you have things like oil refineries and other chemical plants, petrochemical plants, adjacent to neighborhoods. These are all neighborhoods here, people are living adjacent to these. And of course, as some of you know, if you drive east on the 10 freeway or whatever, other highways, the further east you go, the more intense the smells, the aromas get of the petrochemical plants. Well, imagine living right next to that, right? Imagine like drinking the water that comes from the wells near those places. What happens as a result? Cancer happens as a result. So like in Louisiana, there's a thing called the cancer corridor, or some people call it the death corridor. It's basically incredibly high rates of cancer occurring along the Mississippi River because of the petrochemical plants and the sort of waste that's dumped into the water supplies and the land. That happens here in Houston too, but it's not talked about as much. There's very little regulation, you'd be surprised. In Texas and Louisiana, maybe you wouldn't be surprised. They claim to have it fairly regulated, but the reality is a lot of the data is fudged somewhat in terms of what goes into the air, the water, and the land. So environmental racism sites are places where this sort of thing is occurring. And this project hopes to shine a light on that some way. This field guide, I think we discussed yesterday, might take the form of an app. We're hoping for a phone or a tablet, so you can actually walk in the field and using live data, access crowdsourced maps, basically. And on those maps would be information. I mean, this is not a close example, but it'd be something like this, right? It would actually have, like, say, a site name, like this plant, but produced by members of the public, by students, by myself. There'd be photographs, there'd be recordings, there'd be stories. So the interest is getting people in the community to tell their stories, right? I want to hear their narratives and their histories of how this is affecting them and their families. So it's not just, an artist coming in, being sort of airlifted into a place and just shining a light on it and critiquing it. I don't want to come across as like an outsider, you know. In a way I am, because I know I no longer live here, but in a way I'm not, because I'm from here, so I'm invested. So I began looking around, and originally there's a site that I investigated a few days ago when I first landed that's really topical right now. The mayor, I guess, is involved in getting Union Pacific Railroad, who owns the property, to sort of do stronger testing or more intensive testing to understand what's happening. Essentially, it's a creosote site. Creosote's the stuff they use to like basically waterproof lumber for railroad ties. So back in the early 20th century, this company that's now Union Pacific would coat their railroad ties in creosote, and a lot of that was just dumped onto the land, the chemicals. And so there's what now appears to be a cancer spike in that part of the 5th Ward, which is northeast Houston, off Liberty Drive, and I think it's Lockwood Drive, essentially. And that, they think, is associated with that history of this industrial site. There's a large landfill nearby that's also probably part of it. So I went there and I took some photographs. I recorded some sounds of the region. I uploaded a few to a website that I use. It's a different tool that I use called Radio Apparis. This is actually someone I know in Berlin who runs this website. It's been running for about, 13 years now. But basically it's a crowdsourced audio field recording site. So anyone in the public can go out, in the field and click on the map, upload a sound file, and you can describe it. So anyone else in the world can listen to it and download it and use it for whatever they want to. So it's very much like an open source thing. These numbers represent the actual number of recordings. So zooming in to the Houston area, a lot of these recordings are probably mine, to be honest. I've been adding recordings to this website for about, since it started in 2008 when I lived in Berlin, so quite some time. But zooming into the place of interest, I was going to show you. So we're here, University of Houston. Northeast Houston is this gigantic rail yard. This is basically where it's located. So the site that I first looked at is over here. This is the place. It's just a big scab of a landscape right now. You could see what were like foundations for the buildings. It's been fenced off by the railroad company. And a lot of the homes along this side I have photographs of are basically on Liberty Road, are just abandoned and just falling apart. But people do live, 10 feet behind that is a house, and there's families, and they're exposed to this stuff on a daily basis. So it's a fascinating site, and it's a troubled site, and I think it needs some attention. So I poked around for about 3 or 4 hours, took photos, made some recordings of sounds. This is an example of what one of those sounds is like. For instance, you can see it's got the address automatically. The date is here, so that's built in forever. Find this recording. I think I just left it blank for this one, but you can just click play and it'll start playing the sound. That is basically just the sound of like the ambience of the rail yard and a lot of insects. That's me getting an email on my phone. Just ignore that. Through the car stereo. But this is a great application, so all of you can use this starting today. You just basically click on a spot, add location. It puts the address automatically. You can title it. You can put details of what you were doing, what to listen for, whatever you think is important. Upload a file, time and date it, put your email address on it. And just, it goes out to the world. You can tell people what you want them to do with it, whether they, consider it public domain, or if you want to give them, if you want them to give you credit, you can select these different sort of Creative Commons licensing instructions in the hopes they would actually follow the instructions and ask you first if they can use a recording. But it's a really cool thing for artists like myself to use. Anyone who's working in music, sound production. It's basically like a gigantic global archive of sounds. I mean, the entire world is, you can see, and this is the planet of sound. It's loading it. A lot are in places like Berlin, where it's headquartered. There's like 3,000 sounds in Berlin, but just gives you an idea. It's a really great resource. So I'll probably use something like this when I develop this project. Let me go back to this. And I also thought of something else I could possibly do. So not just make this informational, interactive thing that anyone can contribute to, but I wanted to possibly propose something that'd be physical on the ground. And one thought was to make a camera obscura. I'm not sure if you know what that is. Camera obscura is basically just a dark room. The word camera obscura literally means room, camera, and obscura means dark, right? So it comes from the Latin word, and it's the first camera. So before we had these things, before we had, even like Polaroids or like SLR cameras, they didn't know how to capture light from the outside world and make it into a print. So, but they did at some point, like hundreds and hundreds of years ago. This is like traced back to like medieval times. Someone noticed an image on a wall that was actually like an upside down projection of the outside world. And that occurs whenever you have a pinhole or some sort of small opening that allows light from the outside to enter a dark space, or a camera obscura, a dark space, and present a real, like gigantic, 4K image of the outside world, but live. And it's color, of course, because it's actual light, but the whole thing is flipped upside down. So my idea is to basically, and artists have done these sorts of things, where they've basically built camera obscuras by just taking a room, making it light-proof, poking a hole, a very small hole, putting a little lens in there to make it nice and sharp, and allowing people to come into the space and sort of see the outside world through this very unique perspective. So that was one thought, was to do some sort of installation that could be permanent, semi-permanent, in Houston, preferably on the ship channel, that would give visitors a sort of a view into this world. So maybe I'll sort of leave it at that, and if we can come back to other examples of what I do. But maybe we can also just open it up for questions if you guys have those. If you don't, that's fine too.
Question. You did mention that you would touch upon how these areas are kind of centered around like certain racial spaces. Would you also touch upon subjects like gentrification as well?
Yes, exactly. So very good question. Gentrification is obviously a highly complex issue, right? I mean, we're all sort of guilty of that to some extent, depending on your background, I suppose, and where you live. But artists are particularly prone to being part of the gentrification process because developers look for things like creative types, right? And creative types, like myself, would get a house, say like in a cheaper neighborhood that we can afford, but we want to have certain things like, a decent place to get like food and like a good coffee shop. So a developer says, oh look, there's a guy that might want this sort of thing. Let's build all these, properties around that in that neighborhood. But the people who live in the neighborhood before I arrive, for instance, that's where the tension results, right? And it's a problem that, I think just persists, and now every city has been dealing with it for decades. It's just occurring in all quarters, so that would be a potential pitfall to avoid. But I'm not interested in, like, say, looking, or for including sites of gentrification that have already occurred, but maybe looking towards ones that could occur as part of this field guide, right? So if there's an area of, say, East Houston that could fall into that gentrification spiral, right? It's kind of like irreversible at some point. Not sure what happened there, but that's a nice color red. That could be interesting to think about, say, so this is a toxic landscape, or was at one point. Let's say we get it cleaned up, there's like a nice new trail that comes through that the, say, Buffalo Bio Partnership helps to put a trail in like a park and sort of interactive site or whatever on it. What happens as a result of that? The developers then come in and displace the people who lived before. It's very possible. So those things should all be included in this kind of like dynamic that occurs, but the purpose of this field guide would be to kind of shine light on those spaces, to draw attention to them, right? Some things we just can't avoid happening. So that would be something that we would definitely want to include. It's a good idea. That's kind of the idea that I'm looking for. So it's perfect. You should get involved. Thank you. Next, anyone else?
Can you talk a little bit more about...
There was one.
When you mentioned that map with all the soundscapes and everything, do you find that when you go around, a lot of them are licensed under public domain?
The ones that are on this Appareil website? Yeah, well, they're all public, well, they're public domain or Creative Commons, so there's no copyrighted. Like the developer decided not to allow traditional copyrighted audio, but you basically would need to select from the different levels of Creative Commons licenses. So oftentimes I'll select the one that says, notify me, you cannot remix it without contacting me or giving me credit first, you know. That seems fair enough. But some people just don't care. They're just like, you know, take it, do whatever you want with it, download it. But the idea is that it's very much like an honor system thing, yeah. And anyone else, or Melissa, did you have a question?
I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about what, you know, we've been trying to make connections at UH into other departments.
Right.
And like what other kinds of students with different majors could get involved? Because this isn't just an art project. it's
Exactly.
really trying to bring together interdisciplinary collaboration.
Right, great point. No, good question. Because of my own work, and you know, I like art and I make art, but my art has to involve other things. So I oftentimes get the expertise of, say, people like engineers, like in the case of this sonification project, or architects. They know, you know, things that I don't know. Even lawyers. I've actually worked with lawyers in the past to figure out how something might work legally to make the project more, or to enrich the project. So I would think that you know, students who are engineering students, landscape or architecture students, even, or especially, or I should say environmental studies students would be really great if we could attract some environmental studies or people working in atmospheric and earth sciences. That'd be really a huge plus, I think, for this project.
And computer science.
Computer science, of course, yeah, and graphic design, because we want to have an app that also works, so computer science would be important. I'm interested in AI. I'm not sure why this went away, but there we go. I did a project for, I went back to grad school late in life. About 5 years ago, I went to the University of Oxford, which is this old school you may have heard about in England, also known as Hogwarts. And I did a project did a film for my thesis called Humans Lived Here Once. And it was about extinction. But part of the film included artificial intelligence as one of the things that might drive the human species into extinction. And that's being actually discussed in Oxford. So the film was set in England. And the reason I chose that, not just because I was there at the time and I was working on my project there, but because that's where certain things were developed, like the study of geology, the idea of geology. Deep time, as we know it, basically was formed in the late 18th century by James Hutton, who was a Scottish physicist at the time, whatever that would have been called, who developed the idea of geology as we know it. So he knew the Earth was more than 6,000 years old, and he went to a place to prove it. So I looked at things like that deep time of geology, that kind of mindset of using deep time to think about the deep future as well. But I also, you know, England's also where they developed like the first computer, where the Industrial Revolution first occurred, right, with the burning of coal and steam powered locomotives. So it was all these firsts that occur that sort of like have taken us to this point that we're like basically at now, which is like a very industrialized society, very technological, but also in a way kind of self-consuming. And AI, or artificial intelligence, is part of that. So there's an entire like school at Oxford dedicated to studying the future of existential threats, basically, and the future of AI as a potential driver of extinction. Kind of a bummer, I know, but to me it was fascinating. That's actually why I went to that school, to work with people in that school, in that department, and the art school to develop the research and the film that I put together. So that's a good example of how you can work with, say, you know, scientists or academics to get at something which I think is visually, you know, artistic. the way I look at art anyway. So, but it's essentially a 20-minute film that shows on a screen like this, you know, with special chairs, and there's some sculptural components in this particular iteration of the project. This is a ShopBot CNC router created model of the Earth, or like a photograph, the first photograph of the Earth ever taken from the Apollo 11 crew. And then the dust from that process is scattered on the ground in this sort of negative form. So that's very much kind of a conceptual piece to the project. But yeah, so that's how I would like to include people like computer scientists, you know, not that way, but in a way, as far as this project. So yeah. Anyone else? Yes.
How would you say you can find inspiration? Do you think it helps to live in like an environment that's kind of diverse?
Absolutely, right, because that was my first sort of complaint when I moved to Minnesota, to be honest. It's a very white state, but I live in Minneapolis, which is quite diverse. So the first 2 years I was in Minnesota, I was actually commuting out of state, so I was really not there. But in 2019, I moved to Minneapolis, moved into like a proper place in Minneapolis with my partner. And of course, you know, 9 months later, George Floyd was murdered, right? So that put like a point on that part of the timeline of my existence in Minneapolis. And it really gave me a new way of looking at the city, you know, for instance. And a lot of the art that's occurring right now in the Twin Cities region is a response to that particular event, right? That murder. And the things that came from that, the uprising as a result of that. So diversity is key. It's diverse. It helps not just, you know, well, it benefits the culture of the place, but also I think benefits it benefits many things, but it benefits the cultural output of a place as well, right? Because different perspectives are exactly what the art world thrives on, right? If it was all the same idea, it was like just a bunch of white guys making minimalist sculptures forever, that would kind of get boring. Like I wouldn't want to be an artist if that was the case, and if the American art world was just that. So that's a very important thing for me to sort of live and work in that environment. Yeah. Anyone else? Great. Well, thanks again for coming.
You all know that you have an assignment associated with this lecture that is due, I don't remember when. September 30th. On the 30th. Okay, so you have a few days to check out Steve's website and any of the things that he showed us tonight. But if you would just give him a hand and thank him.
Thank you.